Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday the 12th of January 2022, and in this programme tonight we'll be discussing the United Nations hatred against Israel. Now, the United Nations has an agency called the United Nations Human Rights Commission, and this commission has been voted for an investigation to permanently investigate Israel and Israel's activities. And the extent of this has been described as the most anti-Israel and the most shocking UN agency to be established to permanently discredit Israel, to allege that Israel's involved in war crimes, that Israel's alleged in crimes against humanity, against the Palestinians. It's designed to support the BDS movement that supports economic sanctions against Israel and disinvestments, but it also wants to take Israel to the International Criminal Court in The Hague for alleged war crimes. So this is a truly shocking UN initiative that's set up. Regan, well done for last week. You did very well on your own. So you did very well. So it's
would have rather had you there.
I don't know what state I would have been in if you had been there. I've
probably
been any worse anyway. So if I'd be any good anyway. So it's good to be back. But what were your thoughts on this new initiative set up by the United Nations Human Rights Council that's established a permanent commission of inquiry to investigate Israel for alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, and this has been described as the most vile and most anti-Semitic investigation ever by the United Nations. And why hasn't it been in our news? It hasn't even really been much in the Israeli news either. It was only when I saw an article, this one, I thought that this is something quite significant.
The one thing that's not new about it is the latent bias that the UN has specifically against Israel. Let's not consider that Hamas is a terror organization. Let's not consider that they fired 4,000 rockets into Israel. What's a nation supposed to do when it has rockets fired into it? Is it not supposed to respond? Is it not supposed to in some way show some of its military power to defend its citizens? Does it not have that right or that priority? There's no investigation going on of Hamas. There's no investigation that's going on against the on the other side of things. If you look elsewhere in among the Palestinian contingent, I think the Israeli representative in the UN summed it up quite well, that this essentially reveals an ongoing bias against Israel explicitly, but the quote is that it pre-assumes Israel violations of international law rather than presuming innocence, which is required. So this isn't new in one way. We routinely see that that Israel is generally presumed to be guilty of something. They're constantly labeled in various ways as even as an apartheid state, or spoken of in a way that views them as terrorists to some degree. But what is new, Simon, is that this is an open-ended investigation that will cost a massive sum of money.
It's got a budget of over £5 million a year.
It's incredible.
To actually investigate Israel.
To investigate a nation state that UN approved of. And it's not just like, let's investigate what happened in 2021. This goes all the way back. They want to investigate since the 1940s. So honestly, Simon, it looks to be a bit of a witch hunt when you can consider, okay, well, what about the crimes, objectively verifiable and observable war crimes against Israel as a nation state that have been carried out, perpetrated and perpetuated by the Palestinian groups. They've varied over the years, and other entities. I mean, just you can consider some of the stats from the Second Intifada, which is in fairly recent memory, between 2000 and 2005. You had 8,341 Israelis wounded. 5,676 of those were civilians. You can look at those who actually died, and the statistics vary, but counterterrorism group identified 887 civilians killed in that Second Intifada alone, and those are recorded registered deaths, 124 minors in that. So, let's not talk about terror acts against Israel. Let's go against Israel. That's what's going on here.
No, absolutely. So this commission of inquiry is led by the former High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, which has unprecedented scope to demonize Israel. And Navi Pillay, who is an 80-year-old woman from South Africa, is known for a direct involvement and support for the infamous Goldstone report that investigated Israel and their investigation found to be false. Her two deputies have years of experience condemning Israel. The new institution within the United Nations Human Rights Council is known as the Commission of Inquiry, will have unprecedented powers and a budget to permanently investigate Israel for alleged war crimes, with the intention of taking Israeli political leaders and generals to be prosecuted in the International Criminal Court in The Hague for war crimes. So effectively, this will disable Israel's ability to actually defend itself and will be attacked in the international arena, which isn't the UN.
According to the Jerusalem Institute for Public Affairs, the UN Human Rights Council has launched the most hostile anti-Israel inquiry in UN history. Gilad Erdan, an envoy involved, described this as despicable and biased. It is a horrific anti-Semitic attack on Israel, the most horrific one ever undertaken by the United Nations, but it has, as you acknowledged, Simon, received very little news coverage. I mean, in one way, in the West, we have to look at it, a lot of the news coverage is going to be anti-Israel, anti-Semitic to some degree anyway, but even in Israel as well. I mean, a couple of articles here and there, but no really in-depth analysis that is unpacking the implications of this.
Because essentially this is the worst United Nations attack on Israel. And that's why it's so important. So today's question for you, guys at home, is the let me have a look. Sorry, is the UN stepping up its hatred of Israel? So I'd love to know your views, your comments. We are live, we are interactive tonight.
We already have one. Hi guys, why am I not surprised at the antics of the UN? It's very plain who we're up against and that they're part of one world government. Love, Shalom, Dory. Thank you for that, Dorian. Indeed, Simon, it is tiresome. It is wearying. This is a bit of a tired thing. You know, when it comes to the UN, they are constantly, especially since 2006. Since 2006, it seems as though they've had this big target on Israel, desiring to, basically carry out a witch hunt and find Israel guilty of war crimes.
Yeah, but we've also seen other horrendous General Assembly resolutions against Israel, sponsored by Barack Obama and his administration against Israel. And it seems that Israel is the whipping boy when it comes to the United Nations, and that Israel is the Jew among the nations being targeted regarding anti-Semitism, that Israel is singled out more than any other nation by the United Nations. So let's have a look at this excellently produced video. And this is courtesy of the Israeli Foreign Ministry looking into the United Nations Human Rights Council.
The UN Human Rights Council is not a body of human rights experts. In fact, it's a political body made up of 47 member states, among them some of the most egregious violators of human rights, including Cuba, Somalia, Iraq, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. Thus, it is not surprising that the UNHRC's report is one-sided and predisposed against Israel from the start. It was drafted by unprofessional individuals lacking any relevant expertise. In fact, the Human Rights Council serves as a political weapon for the Hamas terrorist organization, thus forfeiting any moral legitimacy. Will you allow human rights abusers to set the global standard on human rights while serving as a mouthpiece for Hamas? Say no to the HRC resolution on the COI report.
And that's thanks to the Israeli Foreign Ministry. I think as Christians, we need to wake up and realize that we are living in the end times, that we are in 2022, and effectively what this new UN Human Rights Commission represents is a fundamental attack on Israel's legitimacy as a nation, its sovereignty as an individual country, and also what it represents in terms of a Jewish state, that the world is moving against Israel. And the sad thing is with this one, we see repeated patterns. Whenever Israel is involved in a conflict of self-defense, fighting against Hamas or against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, what we find is that the Palestinian Authority then use their friends in the international International Organization of Cooperation and other like-minded Islamist nations with the support of Pakistan to say, look, you need to go to the United Nations Human Rights Council and say that Israel is committing war crimes and crimes of genocide. You need to investigate this. So over the last 20 years, we've had almost this constant reporting by the UN on Israel, condemning Israel for these actions without even taking into account the violence committed by Hamas and the terrorism committed by Palestinian terror organizations as a way of eroding Israel's moral authority and standing in the world. But also what's new about this one is that this is a permanent commission of inquiry set up to investigate Israel. That's ultimate objective is the main aim of the Palestinian Authority, and that is to bring criminal proceedings against Israeli leaders and against Israeli generals for so-called committing acts of genocide and crimes against humanity. Now, this is all very well, but it does not reflect any reality whatsoever. That Israel is facing asymmetrical warfare, and you'll find in none of these UN reports they mention that Hamas fire rockets and missiles into Israel. None of them will address the Hamas or the Palestinian Authority education system or its media with hatred and incitement to violence against Israel. But neither does it say how Hamas use women and children as human shields when they fire these rockets at Israel and deliberately put schools, hospitals, ambulances in the direct firing line of Israelis' retaliation, because this is where they fire the rockets and missiles from.
So if we consider, Simon, the origins of this mess, I mean, we could go all the way back and talk about various interactions, various unhelpful interruptions by the UN, but in 2005, the Bush administration completely, they pressured the UN, and Kofi Annan, who was at that time the UN secretary, disbanded what was at that point called the UN Human Rights Commission. Okay, so the reason it was disbanded, the reason it closed, and the reason the Bush administration was really heavy in applying that pressure was that the commission was endemically anti-Semitic. So what is the UN's response? Well, we don't have our UN Human Rights Commission anymore, so guys, let's set up something else with the same initials, and let's call it the UN Human Rights Council. And let's, avoid the endemic anti-Semitism. No, let's make it even more anti-Semitic. Let's make this the primary agenda. Let's take, Israel and make it a permanent agenda item for our dealings. So item number 7 in their articles, it's the only permanent agenda item that deals with a specific country. Like the Council's 9 other permanent agenda items, item 7 is discussed at every formal Council session. So Israel's constantly on the radar. Israel is constantly in the spotlight. Item 7 enjoins the Council to discuss human rights violations and implications of the Israeli occupation of Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. We do have some emails and texts. Let me remind everyone we are live and interactive this evening. Please do be sending in your thoughts. Is the UN stepping up its hatred for Israel? We have this from Les. It should be obvious to anyone that the attitude of the United Nations toward Israel is not rational or normal. It is obviously anti-Semitic. Hatred for Israel sadly has increased not only by the United Nations but worldwide. But we should not be surprised if we read prophetic scripture. Anita says, "Hi Simon and Regan, it's great to have you both together tonight. The press is always pro-Palestine and anti-Israel, so I suppose the UN are following suit."
I don't say that. I think that's a big generalisation. A lot of the left-wing liberal media is, mainstream media is anti-Israel, but you look at the Telegraph here and you look at some of the broadsheets.
They can be positive.
There are some very good media articles and news
in the States as well. There can be.
In the States as well. So I think the main thing is that this is such a difficult subject to grasp, that everyone is kind of focused on COVID-19 or Omicron. And of course, then all these kind of key issues get overshadowed.
So with that in mind, Anita, there are members of the press who are definitely pro-Israel, and we occasionally quote some of their articles.
I've worked with them.
But Anita agrees that it is like a witch hunt. I can't believe that 24 countries voted in favor of this action and only 9 opposed it. I believe it was actually 8, only 8. So sorry, Anita, I have the list here. I have to demote it by 1. The list in those that opposed it it's Israel. Of course, Israel opposes it, but U.S., Hungary, and Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, and Papua New Guinea, a collection of Pacific nations. So the Pacific nations are very supportive of Israel.
So essentially, the reason is that this new inquiry by the United Nations Human Rights Council was established in May of 2021 to permanently investigate Israel. Then at the end of December 2021, which is usually when the UN does most of its dirty business, according to Richard Kemp here, who wrote an article for the Gatestone Institute, and this is what he wrote. He said, last month, the United Nations General Assembly reaffirmed its impeccable hostility to one of its own member states. It voted overwhelmingly 125 nations to 8 who were against, with 34 abstentions, to fund an unprecedented permanent Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry, known as the COI, into allegations of war crimes and human rights abuses by Israel. The world taxpayers will have to pay an eye-watering $5.5 million budget for the first year alone, and that's well over twice that of the UNHRC's commission investigating the Syrian civil war. There you go, they're the facts.
There we go. It appears political correctness is more important than justice, and he goes on to say, how can Israel be at fault when the Israelis have only sought to defend themselves? And indeed, Simon, we can look at other nations, we can see the UN not really stepping in in regard to other nations that have a history, a constant history of not only verbal anti-Semitism, but actual endeavors, chartered statements. We desire to see Israel completely wiped off the face of the earth.
So let's see who's actually been on this United Nations Human Rights Council. We've had China. They've got brilliant human rights, haven't they? Together with Russia, Cuba, Pakistan, Qatar, and Venezuela. And the reason is that the previous inception, the United Nations Human Rights Council, was such a joke, is because you had Libya on the Human Rights Commission, you had Iraq, Iran on the Human Rights Commission, and they would just use their position of power and influence within the UN to attack Israel, when these nations have the worst human rights records in the world. And this is what brings the whole legitimacy of the United Nations into question, when they allow countries to dominate the UN Human Rights Commission, when they themselves have the most appalling and unacceptable human rights.
And it shouldn't come as any surprise with names, with nations like that involved as a core part of this, that the Council has convened 9 special sessions deliberately focused on attacking Israel and deliberately focused on targeting Israel for its own actions undertaken to defend its people. We have this actually from my wife, who's an Israeli and a follower of Jesus. Rachel, I can say there's absolutely no apartheid issues in Israel. Israel has always been inclusive, with Jew, Christian, and Arabs all benefiting equally from the country. You can see all together in the same buses and trains, not to mention hospitals, government offices have people of all kinds, different beliefs, living and working together. So this is Israel in reality. But the picture that is being presented by the UN here is that in some way it is an apartheid state that's discriminating against particular individuals. I mean, there's, I believe, 20% of Israelis are actually Arab.
Yeah. Who have the same right as Israeli Jews to vote, to have freedom of press, to have freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, and no other place where you find those same democratic freedoms and institutions than you will find in Israel in comparison to the rest of the Middle East. So a very good point, Rachel. It's great to hear from you.
Part of the current government as well
has an element of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah.
Which is an extremist Islamist organisation, a part of the current Israeli government. Yeah. So it just shows you the kind of absurd parallel universe that the United Nations is actually living in. And thinking about it, the perception of the United Nations and those who work for the United Nations, particularly on its UN Human Rights Council, have a clear hatred of Israel. That's clear, particularly with this new Commission of Inquiry. But not only that, that they effectively see that the rest of the Arab world and the Palestinian Authority being a democracy, and here you have this aggressive Jewish state that suddenly says, I want to go to war against the Palestinians, I'm going to launch rockets and missiles, use the Air Force and Army to attack them. When Israel is a nation that desires peace more than any other nation in the Middle East.
How many times?
I mean, you only have to look at the Abraham Accords. If Israel was, according to the United Nations, committing crimes of genocide and crimes against humanity, then why are the Abraham so strong? Why are the, for example, the United Arab Emirates, the Bahrainis, even the Saudis kind of supporting Israel? Because they would say, look, this is against our fellow Arab brothers. Of course, they know that that's not true. They know that the fact is that the Palestinian Authority have no intention of making peace with Israel or ever coming to the negotiating table. And so they are assisted by their friends at the United Nations to continue to perpetuate the conflict, because that's how they have power and influence. And you know, if you break, and this is why they felt so threatened by the Abraham Accords, because effectively meant they were isolated from the rest of the Arab world. So using the United Nations in order to do the dirty work of the Palestinian Authority. And there is no condemnation of Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. And if you're going to look at human rights abuses, let's have a look at the human rights abuses within the Palestinian Authority. Is it Mahmoud Abbas now, the president of the Palestinian Authority, is serving his 15 years in a four-year term? That's a dictatorship.
Yeah, exactly. A point that I commonly make, Simon, is you can even find on some very left-wing charitable organizations' websites. It's hard to brush away crimes against humanity, and even on Amnesty International's website, they have to own up that there are routine human rights abuses in the Palestinian territories. It's routine. We don't hear about it. It's not a big campaign feature. They don't present it honestly that way. But it exists, and it can't be hidden. It can't be swept under the rug. Now, this is how the current commission of inquiry was instigated by the UNHRC. According to Jerusalem Institute for Public Affairs, the Human Rights Council's resolution in May 2021, so we are going back a few months when this was, the resolution was initially made, it created an ongoing independent international commission of inquiry, questionable, with the sweeping mandate to investigate all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and all alleged violations and abuses of international human rights law leading up to and since April 13, 2021 in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, instability, and protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. The UN Human Rights Council resolution failed to refer to Hamas at all. It did not mention, let alone condemn, the launch of thousands of rockets. I believe it was 4,000?
4,000 rockets and missiles.
4,000 rockets and missiles launched by Hamas into Israel last year. It doesn't mention that at all. It simply targets Israel. Indeed, the Israeli civilian population was omitted from the resolution. So let's not talk about the civilians, the Israeli civilians who have lost their lives or who've been kidnapped. And last week in the program, we were looking at the possibility of conflict. And here we have Gaza saying, we will do a prisoner swap.
Yep.
We'll do a prisoner swap. We've kidnapped Israelis. We have kidnapped Israelis here. We want you to give us some of our terrorists back in exchange for these people, civilians we've kidnapped.
Back as usually.
Yeah. Hundreds of terrorists who are in your prisons, rightly so, and we'll give you back these kidnapped Israeli civilians.
Yep.
It's messed up.
Very, very messed up. And according to Melanie Phillips, writing in the Jewish News Syndicate, which is a really good publication known as the JNS, she wrote the following: the inquiry has been set up to find Israel guilty of the human rights crimes of which both innocent and the victims, and furthermore to declare it guilty of such crimes, not just in Gaza, the West Bank, but within Israel itself. She says, moreover, its remit includes all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, instability and protraction of the conflict, including systematic discrimination, repression based on national, ethnic, racial or religious identity. And so it's poised to accuse Israel of purported crimes of its very existence going back to its creation in 1948, as well as a libel with a false charge of an apartheid, which has become the defining smear of the Israel bashing cycle. So there we go.
Reminder that we are live and interactive. Please send in your emails and texts on this. Is the UN ramping up its hate for Israel is the question. Welcome back, Simon. Praise God, glad you're feeling better.
Thank you.
UN will have to answer to God. It doesn't sound like there's anything fair about it. With so much need in the world, starvation, etc., it seems like all this money is being wasted. How much a year again?
5 million.
5 million a year.
£5 million a year. And that could increase.
Yeah, I mean,
We'll go in details before about the actual breakup of what's actually involved in this one. But I think it's also important to get the interview I did earlier with Andrew Tucker on board. So I'm just going to introduce an interview I did earlier today with Andrew Tucker. And Andrew Tucker is the Director of Programs at the Hague Initiative in the Netherlands. He's also an international expert and lawyer on international law. Now joined on Behind the Headlines by Andrew Tucker, who is the Director of the Programs Initiative at the Hague Institute in the Netherlands. Warm welcome to the programme, Andrew, and Happy New Year.
Thank you so much, Simon. You too.
This is quite a complicated issue. We're dealing with the United Nations Human Rights Council, and they've set up a permanent commission to look into alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by Israel. Can you just talk us through this new initiative being set up by the UN, and should we take it seriously, and how dangerous is this for Israel?
Well, Simon, I think we are witnessing the worst and the most violent assault by the United Nations against the sovereignty of any UN member state, and certainly Israel. And I believe this development, which we'll talk about, which attacks the very existence of the Jewish state of Israel in a way we've never witnessed before. And the developments we've seen over the last decades, I think, are escalating and coalescing in a way into this commission of inquiry. It's not only this commission of inquiry, there are various things happening. If we just take a step back for a moment, and really ever since the 1970s, after the last failed military attack against the state of Israel, the Yom Kippur War, the Arab and Islamic worlds have been purposefully and intentionally manipulating the UN system to attack the existence of the state of Israel. It's as simple as that, really. And they're very clear about it. They make no pretense about their agenda. And the weapon that they use is the creation of the state of Palestine. You'll recall there have been many, many opportunities for the Palestinians to have a state of their own. They had one in 1947 and they rejected it. And unfortunately for them, the state of Israel came into existence. For them, that's the Nakba, that's the catastrophe. And that's what they're trying to fight. And this commission, I think, is the fruit of endeavors over the last decades to do that.
And I'm just going to quote you from Colonel Richard Kemp, who wrote an excellent article this week in the Gatestone Institute. And this is what he wanted. I'm just going to give this quote. He said, last month, the UN General Assembly reaffirmed its implicable hostility to one of its own member states. It voted overwhelmingly 125-8 with 34 abstentions to fund an unprecedented Permanent Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry into alleged war crimes and human rights abuses by Israel. Taxpayers' funds will pay an eye-watering $5.5 million budget in the first year alone, well over twice that of the UNHRC's commission investigating the Syrian civil war. So what lies behind this incredibly anti-Israel agenda, and how different is this, would you say, from the Gatestone Institute's report? Sorry, the Gatestone report.
Oh, Goldstone,
sorry.
Yeah. Look, this is very different, and I'll explain in a moment why. But your first question about why this is happening, well, that's a long discussion. But I think we do have to see it as part of a long-term strategic plan. And as I said, it's really been since the 1970s by creating the PLO in the 1960s and obtaining PLO credentials in the UN in the 1970s. And it led up to the decision 2012 by the UN General Assembly to grant Palestine, as they call it, they even call it the State of Palestine, even though it doesn't exist, to grant it UN non-member observer state status. That decision in November 2012 has been used by the Palestinians and the the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, remember this, the OIC is terribly instrumental in all of this. They're really in the background. They're part of the UN system, and they develop these resolutions with the Arab League and the other members of the G77 and the non-aligned movement who support them to attack the Jewish state. And I don't really think people understand what they're doing. They don't understand well, first of all, what the Jewish state is. They don't really know what it means to be a Jewish state, and that you can be a Palestinian, you can be a Hindu, you can be a Christian and still be a full democratic member of the Jewish state of Israel. They don't understand the strategic threats to Israel. They don't understand the geography. So they make these decisions in this kind of little bubble in New York or Geneva, and these resolutions after resolutions build a kind of virtual reality that has resulted in this commission of inquiry. Now, it is very different from anything we've seen before. I think Richard Kemp points out a number of those elements. First of all, it's a permanent commission. So the Human Rights Council, which was set up in 2006, is known, of course, for its anti-Israel agenda. Israel is the only state that is a permanent agenda item on the Human Rights Council, which is enough to be problematic in itself. And therefore, the Human Rights Council already is biased against Israel. Then in May last year, during the Gaza conflict, you'll recall that Hamas was firing rockets not only against the towns and villages near the Gaza Strip, but to Jerusalem, to Tel Aviv. They were firing rockets. This was an attack on the heart of Israel. Israel responded. And during the course of that conflict, Pakistan called for a special session of the Human Rights Council, claiming that Israel is breaching human rights law. They came together, and 24 of the Human Rights Council member states adopted a resolution to appoint a permanent commission of inquiry. Now, the Human Rights Council has commissions of inquiry. You mentioned one of them, the Goldstone report, came out of a HRC inquiry. So this is a perfectly legitimate thing to do. That's what their mandate is, to look at problematic breaches of human rights law. But to set up a permanent one, that's the first thing. Secondly, it has an enormously wide scope. It's not looking just at the Gaza conflict. It's looking at the whole history of the state of Israel, right back to its very beginning. It's not just looking at human rights law. It's looking at humanitarian law. It's looking at international criminal law. Anything they can dig up will come into the mandate of this commission. Okay, so that's the second thing. Thirdly, it has a huge budget, as Richard said, and an enormous staff. 18 permanent staff members will sit in day and night investigating Israel. They're not investigating Hamas. They're not investigating the Palestinian Liberation Organization or anybody else. It's just Israel and Israel's conduct. The fourth point is that the members of the commission, there are 3 of them, all have a very strong anti-Israel bias. The chairwoman from South Africa, Nivi Pillay, she's outspokenly anti-Israel. She thinks Israel is as an apartheid state. So for her, really, this is a foregone conclusion. She's just looking for evidence to support her prejudices, I'm afraid to say. And then a fifth point I think is very important is this is all going to be fed through to the International Criminal Court. And that's another aspect we need to remember, that last year the Criminal Court decided it has the power to prosecute Israeli leaders for war crimes, crimes against humanity, anything that comes within the court's purview. So all this evidence, this mud that is going to be dug up against Israel will be used by the prosecutor potentially. We don't know if he'll do this, but he will be called upon to do it, to prosecute Israelis. Now, there's no other state in the world, Simon, where this happens to. There's no other state in the world which is the subject of this kind of extreme inquiry and investigation. And I mean, let's be clear, Israel is a state. It's subject to international law. It has a responsibility to live up to international law. Nobody's excusing Israel if it makes mistakes, if it breaches international law. But what we're talking about here is saying that the very identity of the state is being challenged in legal terms. And this, I think the apartheid claim is central to this. This is also something of the last couple of years. Of course, people have been talking about it for years. Desmond Tutu was one of the strongest proponents of this idea, but it's become mainstream. It's really come into the system. The idea that the fact that it's a Jewish state and Judaism is seen as race, and therefore it's racial discrimination against non-Jews. That's the theory, which of course is rubbish, because Judaism is not about race at all. It's about ethnic identity. So I think we have this combination of factors which together constitute, I think, an existential threat to the state of Israel. And I think that's highly problematic.
And Andrew, what would you say? Sorry, just getting the right timings on my phone. What would you say how Israel and the international community, particularly in the West, should respond to this? Because we know that if Israel is singled out, like Israel's been singled out by the United Nations Human Rights Council, with devastating impacts on Israel's ability to defend herself, Israel's standing internationally, but also then trying to impose the BDS upon Israel and encourage states to disinvest from Israel. Effectively, this is singling out Israel more than any other nation in the world, which can only be described as being the equivalent of Jew hatred on the international arena. So isn't it important that nations like Britain, like the United States, maybe even the Netherlands as well, who are friends of Israel, actually pull out of this United Nations Human Rights Commission, because it's clearly not fit for purpose. It clearly has such an anti-Israel agenda. And if Israel is taken to the International Criminal Court, then won't British troops and politicians be taken? Won't Americans? So this also erodes the West as well, doesn't it?
Well, it's a complicated issue. You know, there is, I think, a rationale and a justification for the existence of the Human Rights Council, for the International Criminal Court. They're important institutions. We need institutions to combat major threats to peace and security, major infringements of human rights, but we don't need them to go around the world policing every conflict and trying to get to the bottom of every conflict and work out what they think is the cause of every problem. And we don't need them to incessantly pander to the Palestinians, who are not being served, by the way, by any of this. This is not advancing best interests of the individual Palestinian. You know, so it's a political charade, and I agree with you that states, Western states, need to lift their game. It's not enough to abstain from voting on some of these things. On occasion, you'll see them voting against, as a number did, voting against the budget for this, but they're in a minority. They don't have a strategic plan. They don't coordinate their activities like the opponents do. So, but there is an opportunity. I do think that there's still time and an opportunity to attack this, to withdraw the budget. This will come up for review. We have to challenge the legitimacy of this. And I think our states must be called upon to do that.
Andrew, I just want to thank you so much for giving up your time to explain the latest commission against Israel established by the United Nations Human Rights Commission. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Simon.
We're very thankful to Andrew Tucker. He's the Director of Programs at the Hague Initiative in the Netherlands for that interview. And thank you, Simon, for conducting it. Very informative. Still have some emails and texts that are coming in. Thank you all for your interactions this evening. They've been very helpful. Hi, guys. Do you think this action by the UN is a step closer to the Ezekiel war in chapter 38, where a coalition of named nations invade and attack Israel while the rest of the world do nothing? Blessings, Jackie. Thoughts on it?
Maybe the UN doing nothing. I mean, I think we'd have to do a whole program exploring Ezekiel 38 and 39, because there's some very clear markers in those scriptures. And one talks about Israel living in peace and having no borders. Well, excuse me, there's a big security fence running right through Israel to protect herself from the Palestinian Authority. Israel's certainly not at peace. But having said that, the major players involved in that war are pretty much near Israel's borders. We have the Russians alliance with the Turks and the Iranians. We have Russian troops plus Iranian troops and militias in Syria right up on Israel's border. So I think the stage is being set, but I also think this comes at a time when Israel disinvests from its military. And invest in education and innovation, because Israel's incredibly wealthy. And also the motivation in those scriptures. It talks about them wanting to take the spoils from Israel rather than destroy Israel. So maybe that's a future Behind the Headlines program.
I feel like we also talked about it a while back in some way in regard to the Abraham Accords. It's a fascinating segment of prophecy. Definitely keep contemplating it. Hi, Simon and Regan. Please watch the video of Hassan Youssef addressing the United Nations September 25th of 2017. It's excellent and exposes the hypocrisy of the PLO and murderous Hamas. Keep shining bright, guys. That's from Frankie. You've seen that.
Yeah, it's a very good video, and it's a great surprise because they end up being the Palestinian representatives at the UN Human Rights Council, I think, in Geneva, appeared absolutely shocked. So it's definitely one to watch.
Okay, this reminds me of the court set up by the Nazis after the attempted assassination of Hitler. It's about as honest, God bless, from Hugh. Indeed, there's extreme bias that's going on here. It seems like it's rigged almost. Anita apologizes. She says, I should have said much of the press, not all, are pro-Palestine. Unfortunately, the ones who are anti-Semitic seem to be having the most impact, which I think is quite fair. It's very, very fair. I was reading the Israeli Times online earlier, who said 9 opposed the inquiry and later did say 8. I had a look to check. The whole situation is completely unfair, though. Blessings, Anita. Thank you. As always, Anita. Now, what exactly is proposed? That's something that we have to ask Simon. The Commission of Inquiry, or UN Inquisition, will have 24 permanent members of staff. Let's put this in context, okay? 24 permanent members of staff for this particular inquiry, compared to 20 permanent staffers for the UN Human Rights Commission branches covering all of Asia, all of the Pacific, and the Middle East, or we'll just give a percentage, more than 60% of the world's population, right? So that's the context. More people focused on Israel than a whole swath, 60% of the world's population. It's going to have 4 full-time lawyers, plus a forensic expert to report on medico-legal issues, and a military advisor to pronounce on legal right and responsibility and liaise with law enforcement officials. This is designed clearly to cripple Israel's capacity to defend itself against murderous and existential attack. In effect, the budget, this is a quote, of this UN Inquisition funds the creation of a law firm inside the UN dedicated to manufacturing charges and mounting a global chase to arrest and incarcerate Israeli Jews.
Astonishing, isn't it? And in summing up, the real intentions of the United Nations Human Rights Council and its COI, which is a Commission of Investigation against Israel, is the following. They want to accuse Israel of being an apartheid and racist state, even though 20% of Israel's population are Arab and have the same rights and freedoms as Israeli Jews. The Permanent Commission will investigate every single action taken by the State of Israel in relation to its Arab neighbours since it was re-established in May of 1948. Those in charge of the inquiry hold vile and hatred views against Israel, as been reported, and believe the false Palestinian narrative that Israel stole Palestinian lands and has no right to exist. Also, this permanent investigative team will seek to erode Israel's ability to defend itself from the Islamist terrorist organisations such as Hamas, Hezbollah, and seek her destruction. They also support the BDS, boycotts, divestments and sanctions against Israel, by encouraging businesses to disinvest from Israel, for shaming them for doing business with Israel on the grounds of human rights. They want to erode Israel's moral standing and credibility in the world and are working with Israel's enemies to seek her destruction. The Palestinian authorities working alongside the United Nations Human Rights Council to attack Israel in the international arena, and will never come to a genuine peace with Israel as long as this UN agency is making peace impossible. Finally, the UNHRC wants to bring Israeli leaders and generals into the International Criminal Court in The Hague to be tried for war crimes. And in January 22 of this month, the United States rejoined the UNHRC, in which President Trump actually pulled out of this UN agency in June of 2018. And sadly, Britain is still a member. Now, I think the big question is, as we come to the end of the programme, the West has lost its moral anchorage, it's lost its moral authority, and I think President Trump showed real leadership in pulling the United States out of the UNRC because of its hatred for Israel. And if Britain is such a close friend of Israel, then I think Britain should also do the same and show solidarity with Israel and the Jewish people.
This is a great email from Les. The UN Human Rights Council approves measures to permanently investigate Israel over war crimes. Some of the countries that voted in favor of the resolution, this is very, very helpful, Les, I like this. Bahrain, China, Russia, Cuba, Libya, Uzbekistan, Somalia, Pakistan, and Venezuela. You could not make this up. It's bizarre to say the least. An Arab historian, Professor Philip Hitti, wrote in 1947, "There is no such thing as Palestine in history," which of course, I mean, you can go back to the Roman era and that's what it's called, but that must mean no such thing as Palestinian people. It's interesting, prior to the founding of the nation state of Israel, there was a football match. I saw this. The British Mandate for Palestine, there was a football team that came from that area, and a very pro-Palestinian, very like free Gaza sort of guy on social media posted to all of his followers, you know, this bit of Palestinian heritage. This was screenshotted, and then he subsequently deleted the tweet as soon as he realized the uniform had the Star of David on it. Because why?
The Jews were the first Palestinians.
Why? Exactly. So, Les, that must mean no such thing as Palestinian people. Well, Palestinian people are actually the Jews who were there. So you have a mixture in Israel and across Palestine of Jews and Arabs. There are, of course, others. There's Uzbeks, there's Russians. It's a cultural melting pot. Right, but thank you very much. Very helpful interaction with that, Les. It's ludicrous, Simon.
Of course it is. But doesn't also this very briefly fits in also into the end times? The fact that nations are gathering against Israel and that Israel's increasingly finding itself isolated and alone on the world and international stage, and just shows you the level of Jew hatred there is within these globalist institutions that actually want to single out Israel, should actually tell us enough about these institutions.
Psalm 2 states, this is from Graham, the rulers, kings, and presidents conspire together against the Lord. And indeed, you are correct, Graham, that the UN in this is effectively a racist organization, and it is really all against the Jew, our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, whose gospel is to the Jew first and then to the Gentile.
Because the UN represents man's kingdom, man's authority.
It's a modern Babel in a way.
Of course it is.
Yeah, so guys, please continue to pray for Israel, continue to pray for the Jewish people, continue to pray that they would know protection. Of course, we know God's promises. We know that He has a remnant that He is going to restore to the land. He's going to keep them in safety. All of this is to be expected. We are a people not of doom, we're people of hope. And so continue to pray also for the peace of Jerusalem, which fully comes with our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Simon, great to have you back. It's great to be on Behind the Headlines. Glad you're feeling well. We're back again next week, God willing, 9 p.m. Join us. We'll look forward to unpacking another great story together. God bless you. Have a great evening, and God bless.